The doctor was not yet up, and a servant, who was busy cleaning the lamps, announced that his master had gone to bed late, and had given orders not to be waked, but would be up before long. The lackey was polishing lamp chimneys, and seemed very much absorbed in this occupation. At first this absorption of the lackey in his lamp chimneys, and his indifference to what was going on at home, made Levin indignant. But on reflection he realized that no one knew anything about it, or was obliged to share in his feelings, and that consequently it was incumbent on him to be calm, reasonable, and firm, so as to break down that wall of indifference, and attain his end. "I must not spoil matters by haste," said Levin to himself, feeling all the time a growing intensity of physical energy and concentration on what was before him. Now that he knew that the doctor was not up, and had given orders not to be disturbed, Levin thought over several plans which presented themselves to him, and finally decided on the following: to send Kuzma with a note to another doctor, to go himself to the apothecary's for the laudanum, and, if on his return the doctor was not up, then either by bribery or by main force, if the man would not consent, to waken the doctor at any cost. At the apothecary's the lean clerk, with the same indifference as the lackey cleaning the lamp chimneys had shown, put a seal on the powders for the waiting coachman, and refused to deliver the opium. Striving not to get impatient or angry, and mentioning the doctor and the midwife by name, and telling what it was needed for, Levin pleaded with him. The clerk asked his employer in German if it should be permitted, and, receiving a favorable reply from behind the screen, he proceeded to get out the bottle and a funnel, and slowly poured the liquid from it into a smaller vial, pasted it on a label, sealed it, and, in spite of Levin's urgency not to do so, was even going to wrap it up. This Levin could not endure. He resolutely snatched the vial out of the clerk's hands, and rushed through the great glass doors. The doctor was still asleep, and, this time, the servant was shaking the rugs. Levin, leisurely getting from his pocket a 10-ruble note, and dwelling on his words, but not wasting time, gave him the money, and explained that Pyotr Dmitrievitch, how great and significant now seemed this hitherto unimportant Pyotr Dmitrievitch, had promised him to be on hand at any time, so that he would certainly not be angry, and that, therefore, he must instantly waken him. The lackey consented, and went upstairs, and showed Levin into the reception room. Levin could hear in the next room how the doctor coughed, walked about, washed his face and hands, and made some remarks. 3 minutes passed. It seemed to Levin that it was more than an hour. He could no longer contain himself. "Pyotr Dmitrievitch! Pyotr Dmitrievitch!" he cried through the opened door, in a beseeching voice. "For God's sake, forgive me. Let me come in just as you are. It's been more than 2 hours now." "I'll be out immediately," replied a voice, and Levin, to his surprise, knew by the sound of the doctor's voice that he was smiling as he spoke. "Just for 1 little minute." "I'll be out immediately." 2 minutes more went by while the doctor was putting on his boots, and another 2 minutes while he was brushing his hair and putting on his coat. "Pyotr Dmitrievitch," Levin was saying once more, but at that instant the doctor came in, all ready dressed and with his hair brushed. "These people have no hearts," thought Levin. "He can brush his hair while we are dying." "Good morning," said the doctor, entering the reception room serenely and offering to shake hands. "Don't feel anxious. Well, how is it?" Levin began at once a long and circumstantial account, filled with a crowd of useless details, and interrupted himself at every moment to urge the doctor to set out. "Yes, but you must not be anxious. You see, you don't know. I'm really not in need yet. Still, I have promised, and I assure you I'll go. But there's no hurry. Please sit down. Won't you have some coffee?" Levin looked at him with a questioning look, asking with his eyes if he were not laughing at him, but the doctor was in serious earnest. I know," added the physician, smiling. "I myself am a family man, and we husbands cut a sorry figure in such cases. The husband of one of my patients always, on such occasion, goes off to the stable." "But do you think, Pyotr Dmitrievitch, do you think she'll get on well?" "All the indications point to a fortunate issue." "Won't you come at once?" said Levin, looking with angry eyes at the servant who was bringing in the coffee. Within an hour."
"For God's sake!"
"Well, let me take my coffee." The doctor proceeded to take his breakfast. Both were silent. "It seems the Turks are beating. Did you read the telegram last evening?" asked the doctor, biting into a roll.
"No, but I'm going," said Levin. "Will you come in a quarter of an hour?"
"Make it a half."
"On your honor."
When Levin got home he found the princess at the door, and they went to Kitty's room together. The princess had tears in her eyes, and her hands trembled. When she saw Levin she threw her arms round him and kissed him. "How is it, Lizaveta Petrovna, dearie?" said she, seizing the midwife's hand as she came to meet them with a radiant but solicitous face. "It is going well," said she. "It would be well for her to lie down. Try to persuade her. She would find it easier." Ever since Levin, on waking, had understood the situation, he had made up his mind, without indulging in anxious thought, or forebodings, crushing down all his anxieties and feelings, firmly, without worrying his wife, but, on the contrary, calming her and sustaining her courage, that he would endure what was before him. Not allowing himself even to think of what was coming or how it might end, judging by answers to his questions, how long it generally lasted, Levin, in his imagination, prepared to have patience and hold his heart in his hands for 5 hours, and this seemed to him within the limit of possibility. But when he returned after his visit to the doctor's, and found Kitty still suffering, again he cried more and more frequently, "Lord, forgive us, and be merciful." And he was afraid that he could not endure it, so terrible was it to him. Thus an hour went by. And after this another hour passed, and a second, and a third, and the 5 which he had set as the very ultimate limit of his endurance. And the situation was still the same, and still he was enduring the suspense, because there was nothing else to do except endure, thinking every moment that he had reached the last limit, and that his heart would burst with his agony. But the minutes still went by, hours and hours, and his feelings of agony and horror kept growing worse and more unendurable. All the ordinary conditions of life, without which it is impossible to take cognizance of anything, ceased to exist for Levin. He lost all consciousness of time. Now the minutes when she called him to her, and he held her moist hand, which at one time would press his with extraordinary force, and again push him away, seemed hours. Then again the hours would seem to him minutes. He was surprised when Lizaveta Petrovna asked for a light, and he learned that it was 5 o'clock in the evening. If they had told him that it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, he would have been just as much surprised. Where the time had gone, what he had done, where he had been, he could not have told. Sometimes he saw Kitty's flushed face, now troubled and piteous, then calm and almost smiling, as she tried to reassure him. Then he saw the princess, flushed with anxiety, her gray curls in disorder, swallowing down her tears and biting her lips to keep from crying. He had also seen Dolly, and the doctor smoking great cigarettes, and Lizaveta Petrovna, with a calm, serious, but reassuring look, and the old prince, pacing the dining room with a frowning face. But how they came and went, and where they had been, he could not tell. The princess had been with the doctor in Kitty's room, then in the library where a well-set table had appeared, then she disappeared, and Dolly was in her place. Then Levin remembered that they sent him somewhere. He moved a divan and a table zealously, thinking it was for her sake, and only when it was done did he learn that they were preparing his own bed for the night. He was sent to the library to ask the doctor something. The doctor replied, and then began to speak of the disorders of the Duma, or town council. Then they sent him to the princess's bedchamber to get a holy image made of silver, with a gold trimming, from there, and, with the aid of an old chambermaid of the princess's, he climbed up to get it from the cabinet, and, in doing so, broke a little lamp, and the old woman consoled him for this accident, and encouraged him about his wife. And he had carried the image to Kitty, and placed it at her head, carefully arranging it behind her pillow. But where, when, and why all this was done, was more than he could tell. Neither did he comprehend why the old princess took him by the hand and, looking at him compassionately, begged him to calm himself, or why Dolly tried to persuade him to eat something, and led him from the room. or why even the doctor looked at him gravely and sympathetically and offered him a pill. He knew and felt conscious only that what was occurring was like that which had occurred the year before at the hotel of the government city, by the deathbed of his brother Nikolai. That was grief. This was happiness. But that grief and this happiness were in the same way outside of the ordinary conditions of life, were in this peculiar life, as it were, the loopholes through which appeared something higher. And in exactly the same way, while the hard, painful event was accomplishing before him, in exactly the same way incomprehensible, his soul, at the contemplation of this loftiness, raised itself to a height which he had never before dreamed possible, and whither his reason could not follow. "Lord, have mercy and aid us," he kept repeating, in spite of his long lack of practice, and yet feeling that he was addressing God with the same simplicity, the same confidence, as in his childhood and early youth. All this time he seemed to be leading two separate existences. One was away from Kitty, with the doctor smoking one fat cigarette after another, and knocking the ashes off against the rim of the unemptied ash-tray, or with Dolly and the old princess, who insisted on talking about dinner, politics, or the illness of Marya Petrovna, and with whom Levin suddenly, for an instant, would forget entirely what was taking place and feel wide awake. And the other was in her presence, by her bedside, where his heart felt as if it would burst, and it almost did break with compassion, and where he did not cease to pray to God. And every time when he would be aroused from momentary oblivion by a cry coming from her chamber, he would fall under the same strange delusion as had at the first moment taken possession of him. Every time he heard the cry he would spring to his feet, hasten to her room, and on the way remember that he was not to blame, and would long to protect and help. And as he looked on her, he would see that there was no help to be given her, and again the pity would seize him, and he would pray, "Lord, forgive and help us." And in proportion as the time passed by, the stronger became the two conditions of mind. He would be calmer at one moment, perfectly oblivious of her, while remaining out of her presence, and then again the more painful would become his sympathetic torments and the feeling of helplessness before them. He would spring to his feet, feel the impulse to escape somewhere, and hasten to her. Sometimes when she would keep calling for him he would reproach her, but, seeing her submissive, smiling face, and hearing her words, "I have tired you out," he would reproach God. But, remembering what God was, he would beg for pardon and aid. He did not know whether it was late or early. The candles had already burned down. Dolly had just come into the library and was proposing to the doctor to lie down. Levin had been sitting there listening to the doctor's story of the charlatanry of magnetizers, and looking at the ash at the end of his cigarette. It was one of the moments of rest, and he was oblivious. He had entirely forgotten what was taking place. He listened to the doctor and followed him understandingly. Suddenly he heard a cry unlike anything he had ever heard. The cry was so terrible that Levin did not even stir, but, holding his breath, he looked at the doctor with eyes full of questioning terror. The doctor bent his head, as if to hear better, and smiled with an air of approbation. Levin had reached the point where nothing could surprise him, and he said inwardly, "Evidently that must be so. But why that cry?" He went back to the sick room on tiptoe, passed round by Lizaveta Petrovna and the princess, and stood in his place by the bedside. The cry had ceased, but evidently there was some change. What he did not know, and did not care to know, but he saw it by the grave expression of Lizaveta Petrovna's pale face. Her face was stern and pale, and just as resolute as ever, although her lower jaw trembled a little. Her eyes were kept steadily fixed on Kitty. Her flushed, tortured face, with the little tufts of hair clinging to it, was turned toward him, and her eyes sought his. She raised her hand and tried to take his. When once she got hold of it, she tried with her moist hands to press it to her forehead. "Don't go, don't go. I'm not afraid," said she quickly. "Mamma, take away my earrings. They annoy me. You aren't afraid?" "Lizaveta Petrovna, quick, quick!" She spoke rapidly, and tried to smile, but suddenly her face grew convulsed, and she pushed him away. "This is terrible. I shall die. I shall die. Go. Go." Then came the same unearthly cry. Levin seized his head in his hands and rushed from the room. "That is nothing. All is going well," said Dolly, following after him. But, whatever they might say, he knew that now all was lost. Leaning his head against the lintel, he stood in the adjoining room, and listened to screams and moaning, such sounds as he had never heard before, and he knew that what was making such animal-like noise was she who had once been Kitty. He had long ceased to care about the child. He now hated that child. He went so far as to not wish for Kitty to live, provided only her horrible agonies might be ended.
"Doctor, what does that mean? My God!"
he said, seizing the doctor's arm as he went in. "It is the end," replied the doctor, and his face was so serious as he said this that Levin thought he meant that Kitty was dead. Not knowing what would become of him, he went back to the bedroom. What he first saw was Lizaveta Petrovna's face. It was even more than before pretentious and stern. It was no longer Kitty's face that was there. In the place where it had been before there was something terrible both by reason of the agony which contracted it, and by reason of the sound that came from it. He bowed his head against the wooden frame of the bed, feeling that his heart would burst. The awful shriek still continued. It grew more piercing than ever, as if the last limit of horror had been reached. Then suddenly the shriek ceased. He could not believe it, but he could not doubt. And he heard a gentle rustling and a quick breathing, and his wife's living, loving, happy voice whispered, "Konechna, it's over." He raised his head. As she lay there, beautiful with a supernatural beauty, with her arms nervelessly resting on the counterpane, she looked at him and tried to smile at him, but could not. Coming suddenly out of that mysterious and terrible world where he had been living for 22 hours, Levin felt himself transported back into his ordinary everyday world of luminous happiness, and he could not bear it. The cords long tense snapped. He burst into tears, and the sobs of joy which he could not foresee shook his whole body so violently that he could not speak. He knelt beside Kitty and pressed his lips on her hand, and her gentle fingers answered his caress. And meantime, at the foot of the bed, in the skillful hands of Lizaveta Petrovna, like the small uncertain flame of a lamp, flickered the life of a human being, which just before had not been, and which, with every right and every responsibility, would live and propagate its kind. "He lives! He lives! Yes! It is a boy! Don't be worried!" Levin heard Lizaveta's voice saying, while with a trembling hand she slapped the little one's back. "Mamma, is it true?" asked Kitty, and the princess's sobs answered her. And amid the silence, like an indubitable answer to the young mother's questions, was heard a voice, absolutely different from the subdued voices speaking in the room. It was the bold, decided, imperious, almost impertinent cry of the new human being, which had come whence no one knew. Just before, if Levin had been told that Kitty was dead, that he himself had died with her, and that their children were angels, and that they were all in the presence of God, he would not have been surprised. And now that he had come back to reality, it took a prodigious effort of thought to comprehend that his wife was alive, that she was doing well, and that this desperately screeching creature was his son. Kitty was saved, her suffering was past, and he was inexpressibly happy. That he could understand, and it made him happy. But the child, whence? Why? What was it? He could not want himself to the thought of it. It seemed to him somehow too much, too overwhelming, and it was long before he became accustomed to it. The old prince, Sergey Ivanovitch, and Stepan Arkadyevitch met at Levin's the next morning about 10 o'clock, and after they talked about the little mother, they began to converse about irrelevant topics. Levin listened to them, and involuntarily remembering what had taken place, what had been going on that morning, he also remembered what he himself had been but a few hours before. It was as if 100 years had passed since then. He felt that he was on some unattainable height from which he endeavored to descend to their level, that he might not offend those with whom he was talking. While talking about indifferent things, he was thinking of his wife, of the state of her health, and of his son, to the idea of whose existence he was trying to accustom himself. The whole world of womanhood, which had taken on a new and incomprehensible significance to him, even after his marriage, occupied such a lofty place that he could not begin to realize it. He heard the men talking about their dinner at the club, but he was thinking, "What is she doing now? Is she asleep? How is she? What is in her mind? Is the son Dmitri crying?" And, in the midst of the conversation, in the midst of a sentence, he sprang up and left the room. "Send word down if I may see her," said the old prince. "Very good, I will at once," replied Levin, and without pausing he went to her room. She was not asleep, but was softly talking with her mother, making plans about the christening. With clean clothes and with her hair brushed, she lay comfortably arranged in bed, with her hands resting on the counterpane, and a mob cap with blue ribbons on her head, and as her eyes met his she drew him to her by their look. Her face lighted up more and more brightly as he approached her. There was in it that change from the earthly to the superhuman calm which one sees in death, but, instead of a farewell, she welcomed him to a new life. Again an emotion, like that which he had felt during her agony, seized his heart. She took his hand and asked him if he had slept. He could not answer, but turned his head away, yielding to his weakness. "I have had a nap, Kostya," she said, "and I feel so well now." She looked at him, and suddenly the expression of her face changed. She heard her baby cry. "Give him to me, Lizaveta Petrovna, and let me show him to his father," she said. "There, now, let papa look," said Lizaveta Petrovna, taking up and exhibiting something red, strange, and wobbling. "Wait, we must change it first." And Lizaveta Petrovna deposited this red, wobbling something on the bed, and proceeded to unswathe it and then swathe it again, lifting and turning it over with one finger and shaking some kind of powder over it. Levin, as he looked at the poor little bit of humanity, tried in vain to discover within his soul some paternal sentiments toward it. His only feeling was one of repulsion. But when they took off its things and he saw its tiny delicate arms and legs, still saffron-colored, and its still tinier fingers, and even a thumb differentiated from the others, and when he saw Lizaveta Petrovna handling its little waving arms just as if they were delicate springs, and putting them into linen garments, such pity seized him, and such terror lest she should hurt it, that he made a gesture to stop her. Lizaveta Petrovna laughed. Never fear," said she. When the child was dressed and metamorphosed into a regular doll, Lizaveta Petrovna tossed him up and down, as if proud of her work, and held him off so that Levin might see his son in all his beauty. Kitty, not taking her eyes from him, was alarmed. "Give him to me! Give him to me!" she cried, and she even lifted herself up. "But, Katerina Alexandrovna, you must know that any such motions are forbidden. Be patient, I will give him to you, but we must let Papasha see what a fine young man we are." And Lizaveta Petrovna handed to Levin with one hand, the other supported the limp occupant, this strange, weak, red creature, whose head fell limply in its swaddling clothes. All that was to be seen of it was a nose, a pair of eyes that looked in two directions, and smacking lips. "Prekrasnui rabyonek, a splendid baby," said Lizaveta Petrovna. Levin drew a deep breath of mortification. This splendid baby inspired him only with a feeling of pity and disgust. It was not at all the feeling that he expected. He turned away while the nurse placed it in Kitty's arms. Suddenly a laugh caused him to raise his head. It was Kitty who laughed. The baby had taken the breast. "There, that's enough, said Lizaveta Petrovna, but Kitty would not let go of her son, who had gone to sleep on her arm. "Look at him now," said she, turning the child so that his father might see him. The little old face suddenly grew still more wrinkled, and the child sneezed. Levin, smiling and hardly able to restrain his tears of tenderness, kissed his wife and left the room. The feelings which this little being awakened in him were entirely different from what he had expected. There was neither pride nor joy in the feeling, but rather a new and painful fear. It was the consciousness that he had become vulnerable in a new way, and this consciousness at first was so acute, his fear lest this poor defenseless creature might suffer was so poignant, that it drowned the strange feeling of thoughtless joy and even pride that rose in his heart when the infant sneezed. The affairs of Stepan Arkadyevitch had reached a critical stage. The money brought by the sale of 2/3 of the timber had long ago been spent, and he had obtained from the merchant at a discount of 10% a large part of the remaining third in advance. Now the merchant would not advance anything more, as Dolly, for the first time in her life asserting her rights to her personal property, had refused her signature to the contract when it was proposed to give a receipt for the sale of the last third of the wood. All the salary was used up for household expenses, and for the payment of unavoidable debts. There was absolutely no money to be had. It was disagreeable and awkward, and Stepan Arkadyevitch felt that it was not to be continued. The reason of it, in his opinion, lay in the fact that he got too small a salary. The place which he held had been very good 5 years before, but it was so no longer. Petrov, the director of a bank, got 12,000. Sventitsky, a member of the council, got 17,000. Mitten, the head of a bank, got 50,000. Apparently I have been asleep and they have forgotten me, said Stepan Arkadyevitch to himself, and he began to keep his eyes and ears open, and at the end of the winter he discovered a very good place, and matured his attack upon it, beginning at Moscow through his uncles, his aunts, and his friends, and then, when the time seemed ripe in the spring, he himself went down to Petersburg. It was one of those lucrative, sinecure places which nowadays are found, varying in importance, worth anything from 1,000 to 50,000 rubles a year. This place was in the commission of the Consolidated Agency for the Mutual Credit Balance of the Southern Railway and Banking Establishments. The place, like all such places, required at once such varied talents and such extraordinary activity that it was hard to find them united in one person. But since it was hopeless to find anyone with all these qualities, it was certainly better that the man put in should be an honest rather than a dishonest man. Now Stepan Arkadyevitch was an honest man in every sense of the term, for in Moscow the word chestnui, meaning honest, has 2 significations, depending on its accent. They speak of an honest agent, an honest writer, an honest journal, an honest institution, and it means not only that men or institutions are not dishonest, but that they know how to adapt themselves to circumstances. Stepan Arkadyevitch belonged in Moscow to that class of people who used that convenient word, and, as he passed for honest, he therefore felt that he had a better right than anyone else to that place. This place was worth from 7,000 to 10,000 rubles a year, and Oblonsky could accept this position and not resign his present duties. Everything depended on 2 ministers, a lady, and 2 Jews, and, although they were ready to grant what he wished, he had to go to Petersburg to solicit their aid. Moreover, he faithfully promised Anna that he would obtain from Karenina a decisive answer about the divorce, and, having extorted 50 rubles from Dolly, he set out for Petersburg. Sitting in Karenina's library and listening to his exposition of a project for reforming the status of Russian finance, Stepan Arkadyevitch waited as patiently as he could till he might put in a word about his personal affairs and about Anna. "Yes, that is very true," said he, when Alexey Alexandrovitch took off the pince-nez, without which he could not read now, and looked inquiringly at his brother-in-law. "That is very true in detail, but nevertheless the leading principle of our age is liberty." "Yes, but I advocate another principle which embraces freedom," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, accenting the word embraces, and putting on his pince-nez to read over the passage where he had said that very thing. And, turning over the pages of his elegantly written manuscript, with its wide margins, he again read the concluding paragraph. "For if I sustain the protectionist system, It is not for the advantage of private individuals, but for the general good, for all classes alike, both low and high. And it is that which they will not understand," added he, looking over his pince-nez at Oblonsky, "absorbed as they are in their personal interests, and so easily satisfied with phrases." Stepan Arkadyevitch knew that when Karenin began to speak of what was said and done by those who were opposed to his views, and who were the source of all evil in Russia, he was nearing the end, and so he willingly renounced his "principle of liberty" and agreed with him. Alexey Alexandrovitch came to a pause, and turned over the leaves of his manuscript with a thoughtful air. "Oh, by the way," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, "I wanted to ask you, in case you should meet Pomorsky, to say a little word to him for me, that I should very much like to be appointed a member of the commission of the combined agencies of the mutual credit balance of the railways of the South." To Stepan Arkadyevitch the name of this position which was so dear to his heart was already very familiar, and he could rattle it off with great rapidity and without making a mistake. Alexey Alexandrovitch asked what the functions of this new commission were to be, and then he reflected. It seemed to him that the existence of this commission was directly opposed to his projects of reform. But as the operations of this commission were very complicated, and his own projects of reform occupied a very vast field, he felt that he could not settle this question at a glance, and, taking off his pince-nez, said, "Without doubt I could speak to him. But why are you especially desirous to have this place?" "The salary is good, 9,000 rubles, and my means—" "9,000 rubles?" repeated Alexey Alexandrovitch, and he frowned. The high emolument of this position reminded him that Stepan Arkadyevitch's supposititious function was directly opposed to the principal feature of his projects, which always inclined to economy. "I believe, and I show in my pamphlet, that in our day these enormous salaries are the signs of the defectiveness of the economic assiette of our administration." "Yes, but what would you have?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Now let us see. A bank director gets 10,000. He is worth it. Or an engineer gets 20,000. These are no sinecures." "I opine that salaries are payment for merchandise, and ought to be subject to the law of supply and demand. If salaries are not subject to this law, if, for example, I see two engineers of equal capacity having pursued the same studies at the Institute, one receiving 40,000 rubles while the other contents himself with 2,000, or if I see a hussar who has no special knowledge become director of a bank with a phenomenal salary, I conclude that these salaries are fixed, not in accordance with the law of supply and demand, but by sheer partiality. And so, here is an abuse, great in itself and disastrous in its influence on the imperial service. I opine—" Stepan Arkadyevitch made haste to interrupt his brother-in-law. "Yes, but you will agree that a new and undoubtedly useful institution has been opened. It's a live thing, and it is certainly worth while to have it conducted honestly," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, emphasizing the adjective. But the Muscovite signification of the adjective had no force for Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Honesty is only negative merit," he replied. "But you will do me a great favor, nevertheless," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, "if you will speak a little word to Pomorsky, when you happen to meet him, you know." "Yes, certainly. But it seems to me that this depends more on Bolgarinoff," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Bolgarinoff on his part is well disposed," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, reddening. Stepan Arkadyevitch reddened at the remembrance of Bolgarinoff, because that very morning he had been at the Jew's house, and this visit had remained as an unpleasant recollection. Stepan Arkadyevitch knew perfectly well that the commission of which he wished to become a member was a new, important, and honorable enterprise. But that morning, when Bolgarinoff, evidently with malice prepense, kept him with other petitioners waiting in his reception-room for 2 hours, the whole affair became awkward to him. Whether it was awkward to him that he, a descendant of Rurik, a Prince Oblonsky, had to wait 2 hours in the Jew's reception-room, or because he, for the first time in his life, was not following the example of his ancestors in serving the government, but had got into a new field, at all events it was awkward. During these 2 hours of waiting at Bolgarinoff's, Stepan Arkadyevitch, briskly walking up and down through the reception-room, smoothing his side whiskers, occasionally entering into conversation with the other petitioners, and trying to work out a pun on his long waiting at the Jews, diligently concealed from the others, and also from himself, the trying feeling. But all that time he felt awkward and annoyed. He did not know why. It was either because he had not succeeded very well with his pun on the word Jew, how he had to chew on the cud of expectation, or for some other reason. When at last Bulgarinoff, with excessive humility, received him, evidently triumphing in his humiliation, and almost refused his request, Stepan Arkadyevitch made haste to forget it all. But now, remembering it again, he reddened with shame. "Now I have yet one more thing to talk over with you, and you know what it is about. Anna," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, after a moment's silence, and shaking off these disagreeable memories. When Oblonsky spoke Anna's name, Karenin's face entirely changed. In place of its former vivacity it took on an expression of corpse-like rigidity and weariness. "What more do you want of me?" said he, turning about on his armchair and shutting his pince-nez. "A decision, some sort of a decision, Alexey Alexandrovitch. I address you, not as," he was going to say, "a deceived husband," but fearing that it might hurt his cause he stopped, and substituted with little appropriateness, "not as a statesman, but simply as a man, and a good man, and a Christian. You ought to have pity on her." "In what way could I, properly?" asked Karenin quietly. "Yes, have pity on her. If you saw her as I do, I have seen her all winter, you would pity her. Her position is cruel." "I thought," said Karenin suddenly, in a piercing, almost whining voice, "that Anna Arkadyevna had obtained all that she wished." "Oh, Alexey Alexandrovitch, for God's sake, let us not make recriminations. What is past is past, and you know what she is now waiting for and hoping for is the divorce. But I understood that in case I kept my son, Anna Arkadyevna refused the divorce, and so my silence was equivalent to a reply, and I thought the question settled. I consider it settled," said he, with more and more warmth. "For God's sake don't get angry," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, touching his brother-in-law's knee. "This question is not settled. If you will allow me to recapitulate, the affair stands thus. When you separated, you were as great, as magnanimous as was possible to be. You granted her everything, her freedom, even a divorce if she wanted one. She appreciated it. No, you don't think so, but she appreciated it absolutely, to such a degree that, at first, feeling her guilt towards you, she could not, reason about it at all. She refused everything. But the reality and time have shown her that her position is painful and intolerable." "Anna Arkadyevna's life cannot interest me," said Karenin, raising his eyebrows. "Permit me to disbelieve that," replied Stepan Arkadyevitch gently. "Her position is painful to her, and without any escape whatever. She deserves it, you say. She acknowledges that, and does not complain. She says up and down that she should never dare to ask anything of you. But I, and all her relatives, all who love her, beg and implore you to have pity on her. Why should she suffer? Whose advantage is it?" "Excuse me, you seem to accuse me of being to blame." "Oh, not at all, not at all. Understand me," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, touching Karenin's arm, as if he believed that personal contact would have a mollifying effect on his brother-in-law. "I merely say this. Her position is painful, and you can relieve it, and it will not cost you anything. I will so arrange the matter that you shall have no trouble about it. Besides, you have promised." "My consent has been already given, and I had supposed that the question of our son had decided the matter. Besides, I hoped that Anna Arkadyevna would in her turn have the generosity to understand—" His trembling lips could hardly utter the words, and he turned pale. "She leaves all to your magnanimity, She implores, for only one thing, to be relieved from this unendurable position in which she finds herself. She asks for her son. Alexey Alexandrovitch, you are a good man. Just enter for a moment into her feelings. The question of the divorce is for her a matter of life or death. If you had not given your promise, she would have been resigned to her situation, and lived in the country. But you did give your promise, and she wrote you and came to Moscow. And there in Moscow, where every familiar face was a knife in her heart, she has been living for 6 months, every day expecting an answer. Her situation is that of a condemned criminal who for months has had the rope around his neck, and does not know whether he is to expect pardon or execution. Pity her, and, besides, I will take care to arrange all. Vos scruples. I am not speaking of that, not of that, said Alexey Alexandrovitch with some disgust. But perhaps I promised more than I had the right to promise. Then you refuse to do what you have promised? I never refused to do all that I could, but I must have time to consider how far what I promised is permissible. No, Alexey Alexandrovitch, said Oblonsky, leaping to his feet. I do not wish to believe this. She is as unhappy as it is possible for a woman to be, and you cannot refuse such. How far what I promised is permissible? Vous professez d'être un libre penseur, but I, as a believer, cannot defy the law of Christianity in a matter so important. But in Christian communities, and here in Russia, divorce is permitted, said Stepan Arkadyevitch. Divorce is permitted by our church, and we see. Permitted, but not in this sense. Alexey Alexandrovitch, I don't know you, said Oblonsky, after a moment's silence. You are not the same man you were. Do you not forgive all? And did we not appreciate your magnanimity? Were you not moved by genuine Christian feeling? Weren't you ready to sacrifice everything? You yourself said, if any man will take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And now. I beg of you, said Karenin, rising suddenly and turning pale with a trembling jaw. I beg of you, he said in a high-pitched voice, to cut short this conversation. Oh, well, pardon me, if I have offended you, said Stepan Arkadyevitch in confusion, holding out his hand. But I had to fulfill the mission I was charged with. Alexey Alexandrovitch gave him his hand and said, after a moment's reflection, I must have time to think about it, and seek for light. You shall have my final answer day after tomorrow. Stepan Arkadyevitch was going out, when Kornei came in and announced, Sergey Alexeyevitch. Who is Sergey Alexeyevitch? Oblonsky began to ask, but in an instant he remembered. Oh, Serosa, he exclaimed, and here was I thinking it was some director of a department, he said to himself. Anna begged me to see him. And he recalled the sad, timid expression with which, as he left her, Anna had said to him, You will see him, and can find out what he is doing, and where he is, and who is taking care of him. And, Stiva, if possible, would it be possible? He knew what she meant by the words, if possible. If it were possible to get the divorce so as to have her son. But now Stepan Arkadyevitch knew that this was out of the question. He was none the less glad to see his nephew again. Alexey Alexandrovitch reminded his brother-in-law that he must not talk to him of his mother, and begged him not even by a word to remind him of her. He was very ill after that last interview with his mother, which we were not prepared for, said Alexey Alexandrovitch, and for a while we feared for his life. But sensible medical treatment and sea-bathing in the summer restored him to health, and I have followed the doctor's advice and sent him to school. Activity, being with companions of his own age, have had a happy influence on him. His health is good, and he is studying well. Why, he's becoming quite a young man. He is no longer Serosa. He is full-grown, Sergey Alexeyevitch, said Stepan Arkadyevitch with a smile, as a handsome, tall, robust boy, dressed in a kurtochka or jacket and long trousers, came in briskly and without constraint. The boy had a look of sound health and good spirits. He bowed to his uncle as to a stranger. Then, as he remembered him, he reddened, and, as if offended and angry at something, turned away, and handed his school report to his father. "Well, that is excellent," said Karenin. "You now may go and play." "He has grown tall and slender, and lost his childish look, and become a real boy. I like it," remarked Stepan Arkadyevitch, with a smile. "Do you remember me?" The boy quickly glanced at his father. "I remember you, mon oncle," answered the boy, looking at Stepan Arkadyevitch, and then casting down his eyes. The uncle called the lad to him, and took his hand. "Well, how are you?" he asked, wanting to talk but not knowing what to say. The boy, blushing and not answering, hastily withdrew his hand, and, as soon as his uncle had released it, flew away like a bird set free. A year had passed since Seroza had seen his mother for the last time. During this time he had not even heard anything about her. He had been sent to school, and had become acquainted with boys of his own age, and learned to like them. His dreams and recollections about his mother, which after his interview with her had made him ill, now no longer occupied his mind. When they recurred to him he even tried to get rid of them, regarding them as disgraceful for a boy and fit only for girls. He knew that his parents had quarreled and parted, and that he must accustom himself to the idea of remaining with his father. The sight of his uncle, who looked like his mother, was unpleasant to him, because it awakened memories which caused him shame, and it was still more unpleasant, because, from certain words which he had caught as he entered the door, and by the peculiar expression of his father's and his uncle's faces, he knew that they were talking about his mother. And so as not to blame his father, with whom he lived and on whom he was dependent, and especially so as not to give way to a sentiment which he felt was too degrading, he tried not to look at his uncle, who had come to disturb his tranquillity, and not to think of the past. But when, shortly after, Stepan Arkadyevitch went out, he found the boy on the stairs, and he called him to him, and asked him how he spent his spare time, now that he was at school. Seroza, out of his father's presence, talked freely. "We have a railroad now," he said in answer to his question. "Just see, these two are sitting on the seat. They are passengers, and there is one man trying to stand on the seat, and there they all are going, and by means of our arms and our belts we go through the whole length of the hall, and the doors open in front. And I tell you it's very hard here for the conductor." "Is that the one standing?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, amused. "Yes, he has to be bold and skillful, because the train comes to a very sudden stop, and he might get thrown over." "Well, that is no joke," said Stepan Arkadyevitch sadly, as he looked at the boy's bright eyes, which were like his mother's, and which had already lost their childish look of innocence. And, although he had promised Alexey Alexandrovitch not to speak of Anna, he could not resist. "Do you remember your mother?" he asked suddenly. "No, I do not," Seroza answered quickly, turning red, and his uncle could not make him talk any more. When the Russian tutor found Seroza on the stairs half an hour after, he could not make out whether he was crying or was sulky. "Did you hurt yourself when you fell?" he asked. "I said this was a dangerous game, and shall I have to tell your father?" "If I had, no one should find it out," answered the boy. "Well, what's the matter then?" "Let me alone. What is it to him whether I remember or not? Why did he remind me? Let me be!" And the boy seemed to defy not only his tutor, but the whole world. Stepan Arkadyevitch, as usual, did not waste his time at Petersburg. He had not only his business to attend to, his sister's divorce and his new position to look after, but moreover, as he said, to refresh himself after musty Moscow. For Moscow, in spite of its cafés chantants and its omnibuses, was still only a stagnant marsh. Stepan Arkadyevitch always felt that this was so. Living in Moscow, especially in proximity to his family, he was conscious that his spirit flagged. When his life in Moscow was long unbroken by a trip to Petersburg, he even began to be annoyed by his wife's bad temper and reproaches, and to worry over his health, the education of his children, and the petty details of the household. He even went so far as to be disturbed about his debts. As soon as he set foot in Petersburg, and entered that circle where life was really life, and not vegetating, as in Moscow, immediately all such thoughts disappeared, like wax in the fire. His wife? He had just been talking with Prince Tchetchensky. Prince Tchetchensky had a wife and a family, grown-up boys, pages now, and he had another establishment, outside the law, and in this also there were children. But, though the first family was well enough in a way, Prince Tchetchensky felt happier with his second family, and he had introduced his oldest legitimate son into his other family. He told Stepan Arkadyevitch he considered it a good way to train him and develop him. What would have been said about that in Moscow? Children. In Petersburg fathers didn't trouble themselves with their children. Children were educated in institutions, and there was no sign of that crazy notion in vogue in Moscow, Lvov shared in it, that children should have all the luxuries and their parents nothing but care and trouble. The government service? The service, too, was not that tiresome, hopeless treadmill that it was in Moscow. Here there was interest in the service, meetings with men in authority, mutual services, opportune words spoken, the knowledge of how to take advantage of chances, and a man might suddenly find himself high in his career, like Bryanzev, whom Stepan Arkadyevitch met that evening, and who was now a leading dignitary. Yes, there was something interesting in the service here. The Petersburg views about money especially appealed to Stepan Arkadyevitch. Bartnyansky, who had spent at least 50,000 rubles, judging by the rate at which he was living, made a remark which deeply impressed him. Just before dinner, as they were talking together, Stepan Arkadyevitch had said, "You seem to have some connection with Mordvinsky. You might do me a favor. Please say a little word to him in my behalf. It is a place which I should like to have, member of the commission." "Well, I won't forget. Only what pleasure can you have in attending to this railroad business with the Jews? Of course, if you want it. But still, it's a wretched business." Stepan Arkadyevitch did not say to him that it was no sinecure. Bartnyansky would not have known what he meant. "I need money. I must have something to live on." "But don't you live, then?" "Yes, but in debt." "Much?" asked Bartnyansky sympathetically. "Yes, 20,000 rubles." Bartnyansky broke out into a gay laugh. "Oh, happy man! I have 1.5 million of debts, and not a ruble, and as you see, I live all the same." And Stepan Arkadyevitch saw that this was not mere words, but was actually true. Zivakov was in debt 300,000, and had not a kopeck. Petrovsky had spent 5 millions, and yet went on living just as before, and had charge of the finances, and had only 20,000 salary. Petersburg had a delightful physical influence on Stepan Arkadyevitch. It made him feel younger. In Moscow he sometimes detected gray hairs. He would fall asleep after dinner. It made him breathe hard to go upstairs. He was dull in the company of young women. He no longer danced at balls. At Petersburg he experienced what the 60-year-old Prince Pyotr Oblonsky, who had just returned from abroad, told him one evening. "We don't know how to live here," said Pyotr Oblonsky. "For example, I spent the summer at Baden, and now, honestly, I feel like a new man. I see a young woman, and I enjoy my dinner. I can take my wine. I'm well and vigorous. When I come back to Russia, I have to see my wife, have even to go into the country. You wouldn't believe it, but in a couple of weeks I am in my dressing gown. Good-bye to the young beauties. I am old. Think only of the salvation of my soul. To make me over, I go to Paris." Stepan Arkadyevitch felt the same difference as Pyotr Oblonsky did. In Moscow he reached such a low ebb of vitality that he felt sure that, if he ever attained the same age, he too should be driven to thinking about the salvation of his soul. In Petersburg he was conscious of being a well-regulated man. Between the Princess Betsy Tversky and Stepan Arkadyevitch there had been for a long time a very strange relationship. He always jested with her, and he always said very improper things by way of jest, knowing that they pleased her more than anything else. The day after his interview with Karenin, Stepan Arkadyevitch went to see her, and, feeling particularly young, he conducted himself with more than his usual levity, and went so far in his impropriety that he could not retrieve his steps, and, unfortunately, he felt that she was not only displeased, but even opposed to him. Yet this tone had been established because it generally amused her. So he was glad to have the Princess Myakaya interrupt their tête-à-tête. "Ah, here you are," said she, when she saw him. "Well, and how is your poor sister? Don't look at me so. Since women who are 1,000 times worse than she throw stones at her, I think she did quite right. I can't forgive Vronsky for not letting me know that she was in Petersburg. I should have gone to see her, and gone with her everywhere. Give her my love. Now tell me about her." "Well, her position is a very painful one. Stepan Arkadyevitch began, in the simplicity of his heart, taking the princess's words as genuine money, when she said, "Tell me about your sister." But the princess, in her usual way, interrupted him and began to talk herself. "She did what everybody but myself does, and hides. But she was not willing to lie, and she did right. And she has at least bettered herself in having forsaken that imbecile, I beg your pardon, your brother-in-law. Everybody said he was a genius. A genius! I was the only one who said he was a goose. And people have come to be of my opinion, now that he has taken up with the Countess Lydia and Landau. I should not like to agree with everybody. It's stupid. But this time I can't help it." "Now please explain something to me," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "What does this mean? Yesterday I was at his house, talking of the divorce, and I asked him for a definite answer. My brother-in-law said to me that he could not give me an answer without reflection. And this morning I received an invitation from Lydia Ivanovna for this evening, instead of an answer." "Now, that's just it!" cried the princess, delighted. "They will consult Landau as to what to say." "Why Landau? Who is Landau?" "What? You don't know Jules Landau? La femme Jules Landau, la clairvoyante? He also, in my opinion, is an imbecile. But on him depends your sister's fate. That's what comes of living in the provinces. Landau, you must know, was commis of a mercantile house at Paris, and went to see a doctor. He fell asleep in the waiting room, and, while he was asleep, gave advice to all the sick. Most astonishing advice. Then Yuri Melyadinsky's wife, you know, he was sick, called him to see her husband. He treated her husband. In my opinion, he didn't do him any good, for Melyadinsky is just as sick as he was before. But his wife and he believe in Landau. They took him into their house. They brought him to Russia. Naturally, people here have thrown themselves at him. He treats everybody. He cured the Countess Bezubov, and she fell so in love with him that she has adopted him." "How? Adopted him?" "Yes, adopted him. He isn't Landau any more, but Count Bezubov. But Lydia, and I like her very much in spite of her crankiness, must needs be smitten with him, and nothing that she and Alexey Alexandrovitch take up is decided without consulting him. Your sister's fate is, therefore, in the hands of this Count Bezubov, alias Landau."